On July 8, 1996, 4 German tourists, 2 adults and 2 children, arrived in Seattle, Washington before traveling on to Los Angeles and then to the vicinity of Las Vegas. From there, they would rent a 1996 Plymouth Voyager minivan to travel and see the sights around the Southwest American desert. One of these sites was Death Valley National Park, the site of the hottest air temperature ever recorded in human history. The week of their visit, temperatures hovered around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or 49 degrees Celsius. They filled in a journal for tourists at a mining camp attraction on July 23rd, saying they were going to explore a pass in the park. That was the last anyone ever heard from them. They did not board their scheduled flight back to Germany on July 27th, and the Voyager minivan they had been renting was reported stolen in early September. It took 3 months of diligent search and rescue operations involving dozens of personnel to find even a trace of where the German tourists had gone. That said, a number of traces were found, but what little was discovered had eerie implications. On October 21st, 1996, 3 months since the tourists had last been seen, the Plymouth Voyager minivan the tourists had been using was located in Anvil Spring Canyon, an area rarely used by hikers, hidden by rolling desert hills and accessible only by 4-wheel drive vehicles. The area the van was found was 4 miles from where they had filled in the tourist journal. The missing vehicle had not been stolen, as the rental company and police had assumed when it was not returned. Rather, the van was found well off the beaten path, with all but one of its tires flattened. Of the flattened tires, one had fallen completely off the rim, probably from the inhospitable and rocky terrain that it had driven over. Where it came to a stop, the rented vehicle was mired in sand up to its axles. It appeared that the van had been driven about 200 feet from where its tires were damaged, before being unable to go any further. No human remains were found in or near the vehicle, but almost 2 miles from the van, a beer bottle was discovered under a bush, and the mark of a human sitting down was found in a small patch of shade under the bush, where one of the adults must have stopped to rest. While they were still in the stranded vehicle, the group had exhausted their water supply, as several large jugs of water were left inside the van completely empty. It's unknown how long they stayed in the van before deciding to strike out on foot. This meant that the only source of hydration they had, in temperatures as high as 124 degrees Fahrenheit, were 2 unopened bottles of beer, and likely the empty bottle they found in the bush. Even at night, temperatures would have stayed in the low to mid-90s Fahrenheit. Clearly, time was running out for them. The search was called off 5 days after the van was discovered, and still with no sign of the German tourists resurfacing. There's a lot of long, agonizing, and drawn-out ways to die of heat stroke, the horror of which would only have been magnified while touring a foreign country, with 2 extremely young children in your midst, and having to lead them through the most barren and hostile part of an unfamiliar country, as all of their bodies quickly approached the physical point of no return. In November 2009, 2 skeletons were found by off-duty search and rescue personnel 8 miles from the abandoned van. DNA testing and personal effects revealed that these were the 2 adult German tourists. It is thought that they attempted to reach the U.S. military base at China Lake, only a few miles away, in the hopes of finding help, but collapsed from thirst and exhaustion only a few miles from the unpatrolled base perimeter. The remains of the children have not been found, but since children succumb to high temperatures faster than adults, it is possible that they died earlier in the journey and their remains were left behind by the surviving adults, before they too succumbed to the extreme conditions of Death Valley. The group may also have gotten separated in their heat-induced delirium, without the others noticing. Whatever circumstances might have surrounded their deaths, and in what order, these 4 tourists have since become known as the Death Valley Germans, and they are far from the only people to die or go missing in the park. In February 1995, a suspected murder scene was discovered in the Australian city of Canberra. An unnamed 39-year-old man was found dead within 150 meters of his home, with 3 gunshot entry wounds to his upper body. To say that the man had been killed was an understatement. Internally, he had been obliterated. The internal injuries the man suffered were consistent with close-range projectiles fired from a shotgun, which the man's family had heard earlier that night, but either didn't notice or ignored because they were either asleep or otherwise occupied, and so did not bother to investigate. Having left the house around 10 p.m., the man hadn't returned home by 5:30 a.m. the next morning, and his wife remembered the gunshot from the previous night and took it upon herself to search the surrounding area. At first, she found nothing, but eventually, the man was found at the bottom of a slope near their house, having been deceased for hours, with the weapon sitting on top of the slope, as though whoever had shot him had fled, leaving the shotgun behind. The initial murder hypothesis didn't explain why the weapon was left behind, relatively close to the deceased, and why no traces of another person were found on or around the property. Upon further review of the scene, it became clear that these wounds were self-inflicted. The man had come home from work in a seemingly normal mood, socialized with his family, ate dinner, watched some television, and waited until his family went to bed. Afterward, he retrieved a bag of shell cartridges, loaded 4 shells into a 12-gauge shotgun, and went into the backyard. He then fired 1 shot into his chest. This shot was not fatal, as most of the pellets fired from this shell bounced off of his ribcage. The man walked from his backyard to his car, where he prepared to fire again. The second shot broke his jawbone, tore out most of his throat, and even some of his teeth. However, he was still alive. To the absolute horror of medical investigators, when he was able to stand again, he managed to walk 136 meters from the location of the second shot, breathing through a tracheotomy that the shotgun blast had created in his throat. For the last time, he ejected the spent shell from the shotgun and fired a third fatal shot through his chest cavity. This time, the shot had the desired effect. Clearly, this individual was very intent on ending his life, but after the third shot, whether through instinct or regret, his hands were discovered clutching at his throat, as though desperately trying to stem the bleeding, to stop the life from pouring out. By that time, it was too late, as only a few shavings of his heart remained after the third and final shot tore through his midsection. One of the most powerful natural disasters on Earth, tornadoes can inflict harm on the communities they impact in innumerable ways. One such way came to light in May 2011, when over 160 people died and 1,100 others were injured after an extremely violent EF5 tornado passed through Joplin, Missouri. The carnage didn't end with the funnel, however, as residents of the city discovered to their horror. As the first disaster was wrapping up, a new disaster was already in the works, and it gave a chilling implication of what could happen with future tornadoes. Neither the most experienced healthcare workers or the most seasoned inhabitants of Tornado Alley could have imagined what was about to unfold. 6 days after the disaster, a seriously injured victim of the tornado sought medical attention because the skin around their wounds was starting to blacken like gangrene. The infection wasn't local either. It would spread after appearing, taking over more and more of the visible skin. Nor was this an isolated event. In the next few weeks, dozens of others came forward with similar infections. This kind of sickness was totally unprecedented, and medical staff were at a loss as to what was causing it or how to respond. In the meantime, other survivors of the tornado were terrified that the same thing could soon happen to them or their families, due to the number of injured and the fact that the tornado had destroyed 1/3 of the city. It wasn't long before things got worse. A few days after the victim's skin became gangrenous, mold would break through the rotted skin, indicating that it was already growing inside the flesh of the injured. The appearance of the resulting wounds was unspeakable. Within 2 weeks, 13 people had presented these symptoms, of whom 5 eventually died. What the tornado's victims had in common was how they had received their wounds in the first place. The damage was not uniform along the tornado's path. Rather, the center of the damage path featured total destruction typical of an EF5 twister, and all of the victims suffering from the mysterious tornado sickness had been located in this area, receiving an average of 5 wounds each from flying debris or collapsing structures. Somewhere along its path, the Joplin tornado had sucked up soil in which the Apophysomiasis fungus was dwelling, which either ended up on pieces of debris that wounded the victims or was deposited deeply in their wounds immediately after the injuries occurred. What distinguishes Apophysomiasis from similar fungal infections is its ability to evade the immune system, resulting in catastrophic infections like those that occurred in Joplin. In a brutal case of life over limb, the only solution available to medical personnel was to excavate and cut away the skin just ahead of where the infection had spread, before it spread any further or deeper in the body. This process was referred to as debridement. In a few cases, the surgeons had to remove the flesh to a level so deep that they reached the patient's skeletons. On average, the victims of the Joplin tornado fungus had to undergo 5 such operations each. One patient even had to have their rib cage removed and replaced with a titanium substitute. The majority of those affected would survive, but they would be left with horrible recollections of the tornado, their resulting illness, and the long journey to recovering from both.